The feuding in Bloody Breathitt, or the Hargis-Cockrell feud, was centered around families in a dispute that began over honor, but over time became more and more about politics and wealth. Willis Sewell of this county married a girl from Virginia and had 2 sons, Tom and Willis Sewell. When he died, his widow married into a large and prosperous local family, the Hargises, specifically to John S. Hargis, who's buried there on the right. Now, John was a senator, and he raised the 2 Sewell kids as his own. In 1892, he died under incredibly mysterious circumstances after performing his official duties at the Capitol. His tongue swelled up, and he rapidly succumbed after eating breakfast in a very painful state. This was the first of several deaths that precede the bloodiest period in eastern Kentucky's family feuding history. And we're here in the Hayes Cemetery in Breathitt County looking for some of the Cockrell graves from the feud. Senator John S. Hargis's children were feisty from a young age, especially the ones he raised from his wife's previous marriage. When his adopted son, Tom Sewell, was playing with a kid named Buck Combs, the two got into a bit of a quarrel, and fearing for his life, Tom shot the Combs boy, only wounding him. Then along comes Tom Cockrell, who's buried in the middle there, who legend says literally pounded his chest. He went to the county seat and pounded his chest, loudly demanding that Hargis blood be spilled to avenge the honor of his nephew Buck. He was also tired of seeing all these hoity-toity sons of the senator pushing around what he viewed as the humble hill folk of the county, and everywhere he looked he saw Hargis in a position of power, all the judges and all the local politicians, and he was fed up with it. So a lot of people say this feud started over some kid getting wounded with a gun in a pistol fight, but there were deeper-seated issues involved, and both he and his brother, who's buried next to him, would die in the feud. The Hargis and Cockrell families began a feud that would last many years. Dozens would be killed in ambushes, knife attacks, and poisonings. The Cockrell clan became the law of Bloody Breathitt, and the Hargises became the politicians. As I said earlier, Senator Hargis was probably poisoned in 1892, but there is no solid evidence. He's buried in the same plot as his son Tige, who was 27 when he was shot down by a Cockrell supporter in 1896. The killer was a railroad detective, sentenced to a very short time in the pen, but before he even got there, the governor pardoned him, incensing the Hargis family. First they killed our father, now our brother. Now that they felt the law was conspiring against them, the Hargis clan pulled some strings to get a judge elected. This was Judge James Hargis, or Judge Big Jim. He would serve Bloody Breathitt for years before his assassination, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. The next prominent death would occur in May of the following year. This cemetery is on private property, but I wanted to tell a story from a distance, and I'll throw in a couple photos from Find a Grave, because up here are a couple of interesting people. The first is Cap Strong. He seems to have been friends with the Hargises, or at least taken sides with them, because he was feuding with the Callahans, a family that aligned themselves with the Cockrells. Remember, it was a Callahan boy that shot Tige Harris, the son of the judge, on the train. He was ambushed and killed shortly after the Hargis-Cockrell feud began, and a lot of people in this county actually breathed a sigh of relief. He was as ruthless a partisan as could be expected in the Civil War, and often bragged that he had made 100 women widows. After the war, he got into a feud with the Amos family and literally wiped them out, putting 40 people in the ground when the war was a distant memory. He didn't like the way the Cockrell family was acting, and he didn't like that the Callahan boy was selected as the regional leader of the Ku Klux Klan. He also had black children. In fact, after he was ambushed and killed right after the feud began, his boy was taken to a mental hospital and put away for the rest of his life. Never heard of him. They said he was a ranting, raving lunatic, and the papers called him his servant. It was his son. Captain Strong's son was named Dick Strong, who papers just reported as his servant, which I think is kind of indicative of the fact that people didn't understand that you could have mixed-race relationships. They viewed it as totally outside of any kind of normalcy and put the boy in the Eastern Kentucky Lunatic Asylum, never to be heard from again. And the gang's name that Captain Strong was a part of was the Red Strings. They were explicitly anti-Ku Klux Klan, and naturally, because of all of the family feuding in the area, the Callahans were put in charge of the local Ku Klux Klan, and he didn't like that. He was friends with the Hargises, so he didn't like the Callahans to begin with, but when they became leaders of the Ku Klux, as the papers called it, he knew he had to act. But because 40 people were already in the ground, they ambushed him as he passed literally right by this river in a cowardly attack. In early February of 1902, we have another example of how the law would target the Hargis family. Tom Cockrell, who began the feud after a Sewell Hargis boy wounded his nephew, had been selected as the town's new marshal. He walked into the town tavern, supposedly looking for the sale of untaxed liquor, and when he saw Ben Hargis, the brother of Judge Big Jim, he shot him dead. Dr. B.D. Cox was an influential member of the local community here in Breathitt, and the Cockrell family entrusted him to guard their children. After all, they were just children, and they were kind of neutral in the conflict. However, the Hargises, because he was involved in politics and because he supported the Cockrells, at least in their eyes, were led to believe that he had ordered the killing of their son, Tige, years earlier. So they got it in their mind that he had to go, and he was assassinated. Well, because he was such a beloved figure in the local community, that incensed a lot of people here in Breathitt against the Hargis family, and the feud really heated up from this point forward. And this is at the Markham Heights Cemetery at a hill overlooking town. A lot of the Coxes are buried here, and my buddy just pointed out correctly, watch out for snakes when you're here, because we passed one on the road on the drive up. It looked like a copperhead. But you can see some of the more influential people. There were a lot of hard feelings, and I can't imagine this being chipped off by anything other than a shotgun blast. James Cockrell is buried on the right here, and to the center is Tom Cockrell, his brother, who literally pounded his chest to demand the feud begin after a pistol fight erupted between one of the Sewell boys, whose mother had married into the Hargis family, and his nephew, Buck Combs. Well, in 1902, the feud was well underway when his brother, James Cockrell, who was the marshal at the time, attempted to arrest a man and shot and killed him during that arrest. Whoever that man was, he was either a Hargis or one of their friends, and during the arrest, he was with his brother, also a U.S. Marshal. Literally inside the courthouse, he was assassinated by up to 4 men shooting from the windows. The killers escaped, and local investigators basically refused to look into it. It was his brother Thomas who began the feud by demanding Hargis blood, and at that point, the Hargises were all in positions of authority. They were the politics of the county, but the Cockrell faction seemed to be the law enforcement. This is the new Breathitt County Courthouse because the old one burned down in the 60s. The most infamous murder happened here as a part of the Cockrell-Hargis feud when James B. Markham was assassinated. Quite a few people were actually assassinated right inside that old courthouse. So some of these signs kind of boil down the feud in the same way that the Hatfield and McCoy feud is boiled down to a fight over a pig. It says that it was a result of some animosity stemming from the Civil War. In reality, a lot of that is true, but Breathitt and other counties around here, I don't even know if I'm pronouncing this county's name correctly, but Breathitt, they discovered a lot of mineral wealth, a lot of coal, a lot of things that could make a lot of people very rich. And when the railroads came in, it seemed like certain families were getting all the wealth from that. And a lot of people felt like they'd been snubbed, like they'd been sort of scorned by their local communities. And the feuds really evolved over that, land rights, and really just the flood of wealth into this county that had never been here before. You know what's interesting is I was talking to a local cop from the Jackson Police Department. He said the Breathitt coroner is a Hargis. Let's take a look over here. Months after the previous death in the feud, tragedy struck the county again. The family doctor who was killed by the Hargises lost a son to a horrible accident. One of Dr. Cox's sons was playing with a gun when it discharged and killed his 4-year-old brother, Tom Cox. The boy who held the gun was never quite the same and would go and enlist, becoming a second lieutenant in World War I and carrying that trauma with him until his later years. And the 4-year-old son, Thomas, is buried in the shadow of his father, who died not long before. J.B. Johnson was killed in the Bloody Breathitt feud on April 1st, 1904, and buried in the same cemetery as Captain Strong on this property that a lot of people think that Captain Strong owned, but he certainly lived within a mile of this place. The man who murdered him was, of course, the nephew of the sheriff, who was a Callahan, the same clan that shot Tige Harris. The feud was now wrapping up multiple families. In fact, papers reported that Johnson's uncle, a Markham, was shot in the courthouse 1 year earlier, right on the courthouse steps. The next Hargis to die was Judge Big Jim, who was killed in early 1908. It was a shocking twist for bloody Breathitt when it was discovered that he was killed not by a cockerel but by his own son, Beach, in an argument over alcohol when he pulled a gun and shot his father. The courts recognized he was genuinely remorseful and allowed the young boy to attend his dad's funeral. He was seen sobbing into his mother's shoulder, right here by the graveside. A short stint in jail was all he served before his parole, but he was now in the center of the feud, yet again. The parole board were in talks of bringing him back to the jail when he disappeared entirely. Nobody would ever know what happened to him, but it was reported that he was headed up to Canada and would likely join the army there. This vanishing act probably inspired some of the Cockerel boys to try to distance themselves from Breathitt County all on their own. And we finally found it, the old Hargis building. The feud leader was shot and killed by his son in 1908, and you can see that it overlooks Breathitt County and the old courthouse where several assassinations took place. Burned down in the 1960s, and they built this new one on top of it. And the man assassinated was James Hargis. He was killed by his son Beach, and his son went to jail for a little while, was pardoned by the governor, and then went missing. Some say he joined the Canadian Army, but that's at least the Hargis family story. Let's take a look around this building. Yeah, and look at the side of the old Hargis building. All of the wood, looks like there was a fire here that destroyed the building between it. And you can see, it used to be a pretty nice sandstone building. There was a collapse back here, and it was rebuilt with cinder blocks. And there is I think this is an open top mine, really just overlooking downtown Breathitt County. So if you want to actually find out where the Hargis Cemetery is, it's pretty difficult to gain access to it if you don't know. Nowhere on Google Maps. It's right up here on the hill overlooking the school, and the North Fork of the Kentucky River is to our left. And this is either the old Hargis family home, or it was at least built on top of the property. The cemetery is over to the left, and the river is right over here beyond this school. By late 1908, dozens of men from both families were in the ground. Tom, who loudly demanded the feud start years ago, had seen his brother James killed. Beach Hargis murdered his own father in a rage, and it seemed like most of the families were suffering from PTSD. However, he did see Beach Cockerel disappear into Canada and probably envied how he could just drop everything and run like that. Either that, or he was trying to hunt him down with what happens next. See, Tom Cockerel's death is something of a mystery. He told his friends he wanted to go west and disappeared for a while. He returned saying he was in North Dakota. For what reason is anybody's guess. Maybe he wanted to get away from it all. Maybe Beach Hargis was up there and he was looking for him. In any case, he returned to bloody Breathitt and told his friends he wanted to move west himself and never hear a word uttered of the feud again. Pretty ironic. And within 24 hours, his mangled body was found at the railroad tracks near Louisville. Papers reported that he died after tripping, trying to catch the train. I think Hargis's family caught him, and maybe after hearing he was on the heels of Beach Hargis, killed him and left his body on the tracks. In 1923, Ed Ocox, the son of the judge, died at the age of 26. He was a World War I veteran and an officer in the Great War. People in town knew him as the Cox boy who killed his 4-year-old brother Tom, who's buried to his left, and he'd never gotten over that accident. I can't find his death in the papers, but you can probably guess how I think his life ended. And just think of the tragedy that fell on the Cox family. I mean, the father died, he was a doctor, and he was just protecting the young Cockerel boys. And then Ed Ocox was playing with a gun and accidentally shot his 4-year-old brother. And a few years later, he was 26 and a war veteran, and he died at a very young age. No papers reported on why, but I think it's obvious. By 1910, it seemed like all the major leaders of the feud here were in the ground or far away. The Hargis family had been essentially wiped out, but bad blood still lingered in this county, and there were bitter disagreements within the Democrat Party over senatorial nominations. The Combs family were now law enforcement, and Lewis Combs was the Democrat chairman for A.B. Chandler's Senate race in Breathitt County. On August 4th, 1938, Lewis and his brother Lee Combs, the former sheriff of this county, charged up the stairwell of the rival campaign in town, guns in hand. The current sheriff fired at them, killing Lee and wounding his brother. The rival, Alban Barkley, would win the nomination, and Lewis again felt like his family had been wronged. Lewis Combs, the brother of the slain former sheriff, was likely scorned from Democrat politics after the incident that took Lee's life. In town, he saw 27-year-old Fred Deaton, the son of the current sheriff who'd killed his brother, in the stairwell. In a rage, Lewis pulled his gun and a firefight ensued. He was killed in the shootout 2 years after his brother had passed. And by the way, his brother is buried right over here on the far end, past Elijah Combs, his other brother, who died a tragic death several years later. Years later, in 1951, the brother of Lewis and Lee Combs would die in another tragedy so common in these Kentucky hills. He was driving a truck with two friends in it when he impacted a parked vehicle and both caught fire. He was immediately named as a victim, but the other two, killed in the ensuing blaze, were so badly burned they couldn't immediately be identified. Days later, papers would announce they were Sizemore boys, possibly related to the police chief, who was also a Sizemore. So all three of the Combs brothers died. Lee Combs, the former sheriff, was killed in 1938 charging the stairwell in a debate over the Senate race. His brother Lewis, 2 years later, trying to avenge his brother's death. And Elijah Combs, who was killed in a tragic car wreck that killed all three men on board. And overlooking downtown Breathitt County, you've got the Combs graveyard. And right down here is the grave of J.D. Vance's great-great-great-grandfather. Like everybody who watched the movie Hillbilly Elegy, I'm a huge fan of J.D. Vance's grandmother, especially his family on his paternal side. And he said in the movie that he's related to the man who started the Hatfield and McCoy feud, but I think in reality he was a relative of those who were active in Bloody Breathitt, which was more of the Cockrell-Hargis feud, and his great-great-great-grandfather is the man who served as the judge over Breathitt County for a long period of time. Newspapers reported that he was working on a book about the bloody feuds in this county, not about the Hatfields and McCoys, but about Bloody Breathitt. He claims that several hundred murders were committed after the Civil War, thanks to old-time rivalries and the rapid influx of wealth and new blood to the county that people here just couldn't handle. He told the papers he'd begin the book in 1903, but I never found any further updates. This did lead to family deaths, but I'll be exploring more about the feud itself and the couple of people in J.D. Vance's family who died in the feud. So this is the Combs Cemetery, but what you'll notice about a lot of Appalachian cemeteries is all to the back row, you've got J.D. Vance's paternal family, the Blantons, and we've even got over here, past my friend, the Spicer Cemetery, which is totally cut off. And you'll notice that about a lot of different cemeteries and family cemeteries in Appalachia, people try to be buried next to their kin. Over here is J.D. Vance's third great-grandfather, so his great-great-great-grandfather on his mother's side. And over here is the judge's son, Grover Cleveland Blanton. Now, he was the judge's son, and because of that, he was also deputy sheriff. And in Bloody Breathitt, for many years, the lawmen were pitted against local politicians, although this was more the case in the 1890s and early 1900s than when Grover was ambushed in 1915, and that ambush would kill him. In fact, by the time he was killed, all the feud's original leaders had already been murdered or disappeared into Canada, gone west to take on new names. Weeks before his death, the judge's son, Grover Blanton, deputy sheriff, arrested two men, Elihu Allen and Morton Clemens. When he was up in quicksand, he heard a shot ring out over a fight about the election and realized that he'd been shot in the back. He swung around and shot Clemens, instantly killing him, and returned fire to Elihu, who was seriously wounded. Grover died of his wounds shortly afterwards at age 30. He was J.D. Vance's great-great-great-grandfather's son, and this is a good foot in the door to understanding the feud. In fact, if we sort of pan over here, you know, you've got the Hatfields and the McCoys, but over here it was the Cockrells and the Hargises. And you can see that the Cockrells were still active in this county. Even today, there's many, many Cockrells here, thousands of them. This is the Breathitt County Masonic Lodge, and Mawmaw Vance's father, Blaine Blanton, served as a Freemason here. He was also the town jailer for a while, and served his country in World War II. Over that bridge is the North Fork of the Kentucky River, and you can see here the police station, and down here is downtown Jackson. It's kind of a bit of a dying town. You can see where a lot of old commercial buildings used to be that have been torn down for many years now. Down here is a first-gen Hummer for the City of Jackson Police Department. And like I said, this is the North Fork of the Kentucky River. A little bit further down here in West Virginia, you had the Hatfield and McCoy feud, which I believe was fought along the same river.
Yeah, Hope Shop kind of
Fading Hope Shop. And you can see we're in Trump country here. This is Breathitt County, sort of J.D. Vance's childhood stomping grounds. He'd come back here during vacations, I think during summers, to visit his grandparents. And there's downtown.
It's in memory. 11 years of service.
So this is the S.P. Lee's Institute, which was founded in 1897. Now you might think that the preachers coming into Eastern Kentucky, and this is the institute where a lot of Eastern Kentuckians gained a higher education, might have been welcomed by the community because it was very much cut off from the outside world. But it just so seemed that when the railroads came in, a lot of friends of the religious folks seemed to come across a lot of property, a lot of mineral rights. And, you know, when religious people go places, it seems that people are very upset with those mission areas. And that is one of the issues that led to the start of the Fugate feud. You can see the French Eversole feud and the Fugates in another video I did, where it all began with a murdered preacher. They would come through, and once there were a couple, basically the whole community was in the pockets of somebody who was living up in Louisville. So we were looking for some information on the Hargis Cemetery. Nobody seemed to know where it was. And the guy we asked did say he knows where James and Bonnie Vance, J.D. Vance's paternal grandparents, lived. He said, go down 3 or 4 miles on this road. I'll kind of show the church out on the main section of the road in the holler. And after the church, you turn left, and there's a brick house, and it's got quite a few old cars and appliances around it. So apparently that's J.D. Vance's grandparents' home. So I'm assuming from the stories he would come down here and spend his holidays with, I just love his grandma so much. And you can imagine a lot of these cars are older than J.D. Vance. Just imagine him playing in the river over here. And what's so fascinating is if the election goes the way it's sort of looking it's going to go, not even getting into the politics here, J.D. might be president. And this would have been the president's childhood vacation home. A little different than George Bush Sr.'s, I would assume. And I found this. This is kind of interesting. Did you see the cemetery up there, John Robert?
Oh wow, yeah, there is.
One flood, and it'll wash those graves away. I think it's the Combs family. They keep coming up in the family feud tour that we're in the area for. It's super cool to think that J.D. Vance, when he was a kid, would play around here on the holidays. His grandma lived in there. Actually, the house they used in the movie was pretty close to this. It might have been this, actually. So J.D.'s grandparents lived in the brick house to the right there. You can see these homes are, well, they're usually built on a little creek like this, and there's a lot of concerns I've heard from locals, at least in interviews, about the possibility of the new mining techniques leading to mountains not being able to absorb that much water, so that when it floods, a lot of these homes can flood or wash away. It happened in eastern Kentucky not too long ago, and I still see signs saying we'll get through this together. And this is the church that you can use to guide you to JD's home. We haven't really found anybody, at least yet, willing to talk about J.D. Vance and what he was like growing up with here. I found one guy who said he knew the family, and some people in the family were kind of a little bit wild, and they really liked smoking a little bit of the green, but maybe not JD. Well, certainly he didn't mention JD, but all I heard was one guy in the local town taught him how to swim. And this is the Panbull Full Gospel Church. And it's wild, these are some of the poorest places in America. There are still some coal mines here, but pretty much everything dried up. And we're driving up to see JD's grandma and grandpa's grave. About 20 minutes drive, but this is the old Jackson Inn, now abandoned. And I'm wondering if this is the hotel. I never read his book. I intend to, but yeah, I wonder if this is the one. And there's the Kentucky River. Jackson's up just a little bit beyond there. You can see the open mining on the mountain.